Welcome! You're listening to the Uncharted Lancaster podcast, where we explore the hidden histories, forgotten places, and long-buried secrets of Lancaster County. Using modern digital storytelling tools, each episode brings a new piece of local lore to life, revealing the strange, the surprising, and the stories history left behind. Let's begin.
Welcome back to The Deep Dive. If you, the listener, are with us, it's because you realize that accepted history is really just a consensus. And, sometimes that consensus misses something absolutely spectacular.
It really does.
We're here to take those rabbit holes you've been thinking about and pave them with the most compelling evidence and arguments we can find.
And our mission today is focused entirely on what are known as unrecorded voyages. It's this idea that people reached the shores of the Americas long before the names we all read in our grade school textbooks.
Right. We all know the conventional theory, the one that's been so painstakingly constructed.
Indigenous development, then the Norse, then much later the rest of Europe. But today, we are basically challenging 150 years of that theory.
And the conflict is just so stark, isn't it? It's the accepted narrative versus this enduring and, deeply puzzling enigma.
It is.
We are diving into a theory that has persisted, despite some pretty intense academic dismissal, for well over a century.
And what's the theory?
That the Phoenicians, who were the greatest mariners of antiquity, or maybe their Carthaginian descendants, made successful and possibly repeated transatlantic crossings centuries before Columbus.
Possibly even before the birth of Christ. And we're going right to the heart of it. We're going to unpack the specific physical and historical arguments that prop this claim up.
So we're talking historical legends, some cryptic archaeological finds.
Right, things found near the Atlantic coast. But most critically, we're dissecting the really controversial physical evidence. We're talking about the so-called inscribed stones discovered hundreds of miles inland, right in the Susquehanna Valley of Pennsylvania.
The legendary Mechanicsburg stones.
The very same.
So if you're trying to catch up on this field, or you're just insanely curious, why should you even care who arrived first?
That's the real question, isn't it?
I think it is. Because if we can establish, with truly unarguable evidence, a viable pre-Columbian connection from the Mediterranean, it doesn't just add a footnote to history.
No, it completely reorients our understanding of cultural origins, of resource exchange in the ancient world.
It's about the joy of discovery, and it's also about having the humility to question what we've been told is, set in stone.
Okay, let's unpack this. And to do that, we have to start with the capabilities of the ancient world.
To even make a transatlantic journey plausible in antiquity, we need absolute certainty about the capabilities of the sailors involved.
You need a ship and a crew that can actually do it.
Exactly. And when we talk about ancient maritime supremacy, we aren't talking about the Greeks or the Romans. They were really land armies who sort of adopted sea power out of necessity.
They were. We are talking about the true masters of the waves, the Phoenicians.
They were, and this is without hyperbole, the navigational giants of the ancient world.
Absolutely. Originating from that narrow coastal strip in what is now Lebanon, based in these powerful city-states like Tyre and Sidon, they didn't just stumble into trading, they engineered maritime dominance.
So by 1200 BC, they're already all over the Mediterranean.
Oh, all over it. They had trading posts across the entire basin. And they were routinely sailing past the ultimate boundary of the known world for their era.
The Pillars of Hercules.
The Straits of Gibraltar. And crucially, they weren't relying on primitive tech. The sources really emphasize that their legacy rests on core shipbuilding innovations that just fundamentally changed how people traveled the sea.
Things we now take completely for granted.
Completely. Things like the keel, for instance. It was formalized and perfected by the Phoenicians for enhanced stability and, for tracking in heavy seas.
It's what keeps the ship going straight.
Yes. They also developed these streamlined hull designs that cut through the water much more efficiently than, say, the rounder Greek cargo ships. And they were the first to routinely incorporate covered decks.
That sounds minor, but I have a feeling it's not.
It's huge. A covered deck means that in rough seas, your cargo isn't getting swamped with seawater. Your crew has crucial shelter. It allows for much longer voyages without having to keep sight of land.
And these ships were big.
Massive for the time. Their merchant vessels often range from 80 to 100 feet in length. And while they did rely on oars, some of their fighting ships, the biremes, had 2 banks of oars, it was their large, optimized sails that were the key to long-distance travel.
All of that size and optimization translated directly into speed and endurance.
Right. These vessels could consistently average about 100 miles in a 24-hour sail. That is a significant feat of engineering for that era.
100 miles a day. So you could, in theory, cross the Atlantic in, under 2 months?
Assuming you had favorable conditions, yes. It's well within the realm of possibility.
I always find this detail fascinating. The sources highlight their brilliant purple sails. That wasn't just for show, was it? Just some aesthetic flair.
Not at all. That famous Tyrian purple dye, it was produced through a secret, incredibly complex, and highly expensive process involving murex shellfish.
So that color meant something.
It served several functions. First, it was a potent symbol of wealth and status. If you saw a purple sail on the horizon, you knew who it was. But logistically, historians believe it was also essential for signaling.
How so?
Well, that highly distinctive color, when magnified by the setting sun or seen against the Mediterranean blue, could be used for long-distance communication between their merchant fleets. It just emphasizes their sophisticated grasp of naval logistics.
So they were technological innovators, logisticians, master communicators.
Yeah.
But only internally.
Exactly. Which brings us to their famous motivation for secrecy. They maintained it so fiercely they were known as the silent people.
Their power was built on having a monopoly.
They were a business-first culture through and through. The primary use of their most enduring invention, the alphabet, was for recording business transactions.
Ledgers, trade agreements, not literature.
Not literature or history, no. That's why much of what we actually know about them comes from the Greeks, who, in contrast, were obsessed with documenting absolutely everything.
And the Phoenicians, they knew the value of a competitor's ignorance. So they just leaned into that reputation for secrecy. They even became masters of disinformation.
They manufactured terrifying tales of the deep. They actively nurtured and spread legends of sea monsters, of vast, sluggish seas that trapped ships, which some people interpret as early descriptions of the Sargasso Sea.
And boiling, impassable waters beyond Gibraltar.
All of it. Their motivation was singular: discourage any Greek or Roman competitor from venturing out into the Atlantic and challenging their access to vital resources.
Like the tin from Britain.
Especially the tin from Britain. Their commitment to secrecy, it sometimes went beyond just trade protection. Classical writers recorded it as being dangerously self-destructive.
What do you mean by that?
We have accounts, particularly about their routes to the tin mines, where if a Phoenician captain realized he was being closely tracked by foreign rivals and he couldn't shake them, he would willingly wreck his own ship on the nearest available rocks.
He'd sink his own ship and cargo?
Yes. That was preferable to letting the competition learn the profitable route. That level of fanatical trade protection suggests an extraordinary willingness to take enormous risks.
Okay, so if these experts were willing to sacrifice their ships just to protect routes close to home, what would it take for them to cross the entire Atlantic?
The prevailing theory really relies on oceanographic forces. The Atlantic hypothesis is compelling because of the natural conveyor belt provided by the currents and the winds.
If you just get caught in the system.
Pretty much. A ship leaving Gibraltar and sailing southwest, whether it's on purpose or by accident, would naturally catch the northeast trade winds and the Canary Current. This pulls you right past the African coast, and eventually the South Equatorial Current would deliver you directly into the Caribbean or toward the mouth of the Chesapeake Bay. It's almost a passive trajectory once you're caught in it.
And getting back wasn't impossible either.
Not at all. For the return trip, they wouldn't have to fight the currents back. They would just follow the Gulf Stream north along the American coast, then catch the North Atlantic Current, which sweeps back east towards Europe.
And that would bring them right back to their home turf.
Typically bringing them toward the latitude of Cadiz, just outside Gibraltar. It's a very elegant, self-sustaining loop.
So the navigational ability was there, the oceanographic highway was there. The sources highlight one specific scenario dating to 480 BC that could have kicked the whole thing off.
This specific theory suggests it was an accident of fate. A Phoenician or Carthaginian ship, maybe trying to evade the scrutiny of pursuing Roman or Greek forces near Gibraltar, was driven far off course by a major storm.
Instead of sinking,
the storm might have inadvertently shoved them onto that westward current track, forcing them across the Atlantic and landing them perhaps in the American South. The capacity was there. The motivation in this one case was just survival.
So the potential ability is one thing, but we need clues. We need physical artifacts or historical records that suggest contact was actually made.
We do.
Let's start with one of the most compelling pieces of non-inscription evidence, one that's far removed from the American mainland. A coin hoard found in the Azores.
This story is so important because it provides a necessary bridge between the Mediterranean and the New World. It dates back to 1751, when a Swedish scholar, John Podolin, received a report about a significant numismatic find.
A hoard of ancient coins had been unearthed on Corvo,
which is the westernmost island of the Azores chain. And its location, as you mentioned before, is geographically critical to this whole hypothesis.
It's the key.
It is the absolute key. Corvo sits at this unique nexus of Atlantic currents. It's specifically on the receiving end of debris carried by the western oceanic flows.
So if a ship wrecked coming from the New World,
its remnants, including heavy items like coins, would likely wash up on Corvo. It suggests a maritime disaster originating from the direction of the setting sun, not just a minor deviation near Gibraltar.
what specifically was in this hoard?
It contained a mixture, which is interesting in itself. There were several ancient Carthaginian coins, Carthage being the most famous and powerful Phoenician colony, along with some Roman coins.
But the crucial part is the authentication.
Right. Dr. E.S.G. Robinson of the British Museum later authenticated 9 specific coins from the find. There were 7 Carthaginian gold coins and 2 Roman bronze coins of Cyrene.
The dating on those?
They were consistently dated to around 350 BC. Now look, while the presence of these coins on Corvo doesn't definitively prove the Carthaginians were returning from America,
It does prove they were out there.
it proves that Carthaginian vessels were active deep in the mid-Atlantic and suffered catastrophic losses far from their home ports. For proponents of the pre-Columbian theory, it serves as this maritime marker pointing west.
Okay, shifting from physical evidence to historical texts, let's look at the clue that generates maybe the most speculation. Aristotle's Desert Island.
This passage comes from Aristotle's collection of works known as the Minor Works, specifically section 84 of On Marvelous Things Heard. It's often overlooked or just dismissed, but it has profound implications if you read it literally.
So what does Aristotle actually describe?
He describes an island found by the Carthaginians, and he's explicit. He says it's located in the sea outside the Pillars of Hercules.
So definitively in the Atlantic.
No question. The island was characterized as being extraordinarily fertile, having all kinds of fruits, which suggests a variety of climates, and containing large navigable rivers. It was said to be reachable after a number of days' sailing distance away.
Okay, that description, fertile, all kinds of fruits, navigable rivers, that sounds suspiciously like a description of a continent, not just some isolated island in the eastern Atlantic.
Exactly. And the passage continues. It details that the Carthaginians began to frequent it, and some citizens even settled there permanently. And this usage prompted the most remarkable political reaction,
The Carthaginian Senate issued a decree,
carrying the penalty of death.
a death sentence, for sailing to or settling on a newly discovered fertile land. Why would they do that? Why such an extreme measure of repression?
The Senate's fear was purely political and strategic. They weren't afraid of the Greeks finding it. They were afraid of their own citizens finding it and leaving.
They were afraid of a brain drain.
A massive one. They worried that the prosperity, the freedom, the desirable climate of this new land would attract so many of Carthage's most capable citizens that it would lead to the rise of a competing independent empire.
Which would inevitably weaken Carthage's own commercial and military base back in North Africa.
So they basically chose strategic ignorance over expansion. They valued central control of the empire far more than the potential wealth of this new land. It reinforced their identity as the silent people
They sealed it off.
by governmental decree. Now, classical archaeologists often dismiss this passage. They argue it's too vague, or maybe it refers to the Canary Islands or Madeira.
But the islands we know of in the eastern Atlantic don't really fit that description, do they? They don't have navigable rivers or offer such a massive attraction that it would threaten the core empire.
They really don't. For those seeking evidence, this passage describes North America vast, fertile, and strategically dangerous to a mercantile power whose strength rested on tightly controlled trade routes.
So if we accept the possibility of contact, then the theories seem to divide into waves. The coin hoard suggests voyages around 350 BC.
Right, but some proponents argue for a much earlier, long-lived settlement dating back nearly a millennium prior. And this brings us to that mysterious megalithic site in New England, Patty's Caves in New Hampshire.
This site outside North Salem, New Hampshire, is linked to a supposed first wave of Phoenician settlement, maybe as early as 1000 BC. And the motivation here shifts completely. It's not about commerce or accident.
No, it's about seeking religious freedom. It's a compelling narrative, a group fleeing the political and religious dominance of the rising Athenian Empire. They're looking for a new, permanent home where they could practice their own rights, free from interference.
And the structures themselves suggest a serious, organized effort.
Oh, absolutely. The complex, known for over a century as Petty's Caves, consists of dozens of complex stone structures. We're talking about massive stones.
How massive?
These are large megaliths, some weighing up to 20 tons, seemingly moved and placed with concerted effort. The structures include chambers, stone walls, and what some theorists identify as an altar.
Which, given the Phoenician practice of occasional human or animal sacrifice to deities like Baal, that would fuel the religious freedom hypothesis.
It does. And there's also the puzzling presence of an unfinished Doric pedestal.
Okay, the reference to a Doric pedestal introduces this classical element that seems wildly out of place in 1000 BC New England.
It does. It raises immediate red flags for conventional archaeologists who often dismiss the entire site as just a colonial-era root cellar or maybe even a more recent construction.
But the sheer size and complexity of the stonework demands some scrutiny.
It really does.
So what connects this particular site to the Phoenicians specifically? Is there a smoking gun?
The strongest physical evidence cited by the pre-Columbian proponents is an inscription, a carving on one of the stones. It supposedly represents a Phoenician ship.
What does it look like?
It's a detailed bireme with a single square sail. The distinguishing feature is the T-shape of its mass structure.
A mass structure that experts confirm is consistent with Phoenician iconography from that time period.
That's the key detail. Now, the entire site is hugely controversial, especially because William B. Goodwin, the amateur who brought it to attention in 1936, enthusiastically dug through it and may have destroyed crucial stratigraphic evidence.
So the context is lost.
A lot of it is, but the nature of some of the structures and those specific carvings, it remains deeply enigmatic. If this was a successful, long-lived 1000 BC settlement, it provides a crucial narrative link for our central story, the later Carthaginian refugees.
Okay, so that sets the stage for a potential existing New England colony. Now, we followed the trajectory of our deep dive right into the center of Pennsylvania, focusing on this alleged 310 BC arrival.
And this narrative is driven not by exploration or freedom, but by total disaster and desperation.
This is the second wave theory.
Exactly. This group were refugees, likely among the survivors fleeing the total ruin of Carthage after that catastrophic defeat by the Greeks under Agathocles in Sicily around 310 BC. Their world had literally collapsed, and they were attempting a desperate flight.
And the goal of this flight was to reach that established settlement in New Hampshire, right?
That's the theory. They were trying to reach the Patty's Cave settlement, if it existed, but they were driven far off course by severe Atlantic storms. So instead of making landfall in the relative safety of New England, they found themselves in the vast expanse of the Chesapeake Bay.
And like the expert mariners they were, they didn't just stop at the coastline. They would have immediately recognized the deep water leading inland.
They sailed up the Chesapeake and then navigated the winding, complex waterways of the Susquehanna River. Their journey came to an abrupt, undeniable halt at what are now known as Conewago Falls.
Near modern-day Falmouth and Bainbridge. Describe that barrio for us.
Conewago Falls is a significant natural obstacle. It's not a single dramatic drop like Niagara, but it's a series of rapids and cascading water where the river descends about 19 feet over a span of 1,320 feet.
So it was a physical barrier that their deep draft trireme ships just could not pass.
Impossible. So, trapped hundreds of miles inland, they had no choice but to establish a settlement in the surrounding Susquehanna Valley near modern Cumberland and York counties.
Which means they interacted directly with the local indigenous populations, possibly the Shanks Ferry people.
And this cultural collision is what excites the proponents. The theory suggests the local tribes were so amazed by these foreign vessels that they actually recorded them. Proponents point to petroglyphs rock carvings on islands in the Susquehanna River.
Specifically, Big Indian Rock.
Right. Some interpreters believe one intricate carving there depicts a massive Phoenician trireme ship, memorializing the arrival of these strange, knowledge-bearing newcomers.
And that initial startling contact, these bearded, sophisticated newcomers arriving from the sea. The theory even tries to bridge the vast geographic gap to Mesoamerica.
It's highly speculative, we have to stress that. But the theory argues that the memory of these knowledge-bearing bearded gods was retained and passed down through tribal legends, eventually becoming entwined with the legend of Quetzalcoatl.
That is a huge leap.
It's an enormous leap, but it illustrates the magnitude of the claimed cultural shockwaves these arrivals supposedly generated.
The physical manifestation of this refugee theory really emerged in the 1940s thanks to two very dedicated men. A school teacher named Philip Beislein and an accomplished scientist, Dr. William W. Strong.
Beislein was the initial finder. He was an ardent collector of Indian artifacts in Mechanicsburg who found a small stone with markings that were just utterly foreign to him. So he took it to Dr. Strong.
And Dr. William W. Strong wasn't just some crackpot. He was a respected physicist with serious academic training from Johns Hopkins. Strong became utterly consumed by these markings.
His first thought was that the marks might be Greek, but his focus soon shifted to the older Phoenician alphabet. Strong dedicated the next decade of his life to this research.
And he collected how many?
Over 400 unique specimens from 10 different sites in Cumberland and York counties, all centered around the local waterways, the Yellow Breeches, and Connedoganet creeks.
And the rock type itself is important here. These stones were made of diabase, which is often referred to locally as ironstone.
Diabase is an igneous rock, fine-textured and incredibly hard, but it's also rich in iron compounds. Strong initially classified his finds into two types. The X stones, which had shallower abrasions that look like primitive lettering, and the XX stones, which bore these deep, straight groove, V-shaped marks.
And Strong's theory got this critical local validation through a remarkable coincidence involving a postman.
Joseph Ayub, yes. Ayub, a local postman, happened to be of Lebanese extraction, and when he saw the marks, he instantly exclaimed they looked exactly like Phoenician letters.
That must have been a huge boost for Strong.
Massive. He quickly sent photos of his best examples to the renowned École des Langues Anciennes at the University of Strasbourg.
And the response wasn't an outright dismissal.
Crucially, no. The school examined the images and stated they could not rule out the possibility that the lettering was Phoenician. And that gave Strong the academic green light he felt he needed.
From that moment on, Strong threw himself into self-instruction. He taught himself ancient Phoenician and Punic. He was convinced he had the Rosetta Stone for a forgotten American colony.
He was. It culminated in a privately published text, Replicas Canon Stellae. He claimed to have identified 22 letters of the alphabet, which he then used to translate combinations across his hundreds of stones.
And the scope of his translation claims is just astounding.
It is.
What did he believe these stones recorded?
According to Strong's painstaking work, which included accounting for phonetic variations and local dialects, the inscriptions corresponded to a few things. First, the names of 70 rabs, which are high-ranking captains or officials of the expedition.
Okay.
Second, specific Carthaginian deities, most notably the goddess Tanit. And third, geographical identifiers of their original homeland.
The references to specific Mediterranean cities hundreds of miles from the Atlantic must have been the most compelling part for him.
Absolutely. He claimed to find the names of major Phoenician and Carthaginian outposts, including Tyre, Sidon, Aleppo, Citium, and the crucial words Carthage and Sardinia.
So for Strong, this was definitive proof that this is a multi-ethnic official Carthaginian venture, not just a handful of accidental survivors.
Exactly, and the purpose of the settlement. Since the rock was ironstone, Strong connected it back to the Phoenician expertise in metallurgy. He concluded that the stones were likely related to a mining operation.
So these inscriptions were basically marker stones.
Used to indicate the grades of iron ore being excavated from the diabase rock. His theory painted this vivid picture. A stranded, organized expedition facing total disaster, breaking up into groups representing their original home cities, all of them marking their desperate, final mining efforts in the Pennsylvania valleys before they ultimately perished.
The problem with the Strong theory, though, is that this incredible enthusiasm quickly collided head-on with the meticulous and frankly unforgiving demands of established academic methodology.
Right. The rejection from the archaeological community was swift, intense, and ultimately overwhelming.
Strong's critics pointed immediately to flaws in his process that would be considered, cardinal sins in modern archaeology.
That's right. His methodology was casual, sometimes even reckless. For example, to make the faint inscriptions more visible for documentation, he applied white paint directly to some of the stones.
No.
He was criticized bitterly for failing to photograph the stones in situ in their original place of discovery before moving them. And he didn't meticulously record the precise locations of all 400-plus finds. He just moved the entire collection to his barn in Mechanicsburg.
And moving an artifact before you document its context, that destroys the single most important piece of evidence.
It destroys everything. Where it was found, in what layer of soil, next to what other objects. Without that context, the artifact is just a curious object, not historical proof.
And beyond the methodology, his translations drew immediate fire from language experts.
They did. Dr. Raymond Bowman from the University of Chicago was one of the first to critique the epigraphy back in 1944, and his specific linguistic objection was fatal.
What was that?
Bowman, a highly respected Oriental languages expert, acknowledged that the marks might be man-made, but he saw them as just random combinations of lines, not a coherent, structured alphabet. But his big critique was the temporal inconsistency of the letter forms themselves.
He noticed forms from wildly different eras mixed together.
Precisely. He found letter forms that hadn't evolved past the 12th century BC, blended right alongside forms that didn't appear until the 5th or 4th century BC. It's like finding a single document that uses Elizabethan script and modern digital shorthand at the same time.
It just doesn't make sense.
It suggests that if they were carved by a literate Phoenician, that person somehow had access to 800 years of linguistic history and chose to mix them all up, which is highly unlikely for official inscriptions.
And what about the other Semitic language experts?
Dr. Cyrus Gordon, a major authority in Semitic languages, inspected the stones and concluded definitively that they were not Semitic. But he raised a fascinating third possibility. He suggested they likely represented a native local writing.
Which is an idea we'll come back to.
Yes, but for the Phoenician theory, it was a dismissal. And then the loudest opposition came from the geologists, who offered the simplest explanation of all.
They just said it was nature.
After some perfunctory, often cite unspecific examinations, geologists argued the marks were caused purely by natural phenomena. Geological faults, plow scratches from farm machinery, or the persistent action of tree roots searching for minerals.
And that gave the scientific community an easy out.
It did, a way to dismiss the whole theory without having to entertain transatlantic contact.
But the ultimate, official coup de grace was delivered in 1964 by John Whithoft, the Pennsylvania state archaeologist. This pronouncement was meant to end the debate for good.
Whithoft declared the Susquehanna Stones to be modern frauds. His definitive argument rested on the alleged presence of fresh steel dust found in the grooves.
So his conclusion was?
His conclusion was that because the grooves were unweathered and contained traces of steel, they must have been cut recently with modern tools. This implied a fabrication or a hoax, and since he claimed the perpetrators were deceased, the case was officially closed.
And this is where it gets really interesting, because the sources we have access to reveal that this authoritative debunking was fundamentally compromised.
Right, it was laced with serious errors and misrepresentations. This institutional failure is the true legacy of the Mechanicsburg Stones controversy. Whithoft based his public dismissal on non-existent authoritative studies.
What do you mean non-existent?
He cited detailed analyses allegedly performed by the National Bureau of Standards, the NBS, and Franklin and Marshall College. But those institutions never conducted the studies.
You're kidding.
As late as 1975, a spokesman for the National Bureau of Standards confirmed they had never even seen the Susquehanna Stones, let alone analyzed them. Furthermore, the one legitimate study he cited by the Pennsylvania Geological Survey, the PGS, was completely misrepresented.
So Whithoft claimed the PGS study backed his point about the grooves being unweathered. What did the report actually say?
The PGS report confirmed the presence of metal flakes in the grooves, concluding it was strong evidence that the grooves were made, at least in part, with an iron or steel tool.
No.
But crucially, the PGS report did not comment on the weathering or the age of the cuts. It only confirmed they were artificial in nature, carved by metal, not random natural fractures. Whithoft used the finding of metal as definitive proof of modern fraud, ignoring the fact that iron tools have existed for millennia.
Or even just centuries since the arrival of European colonists.
Exactly. It sounds like professional certitude actively suppressing a mystery it couldn't easily explain. And the handling of the evidence itself under Wythoff's curatorship suggests a profound failure of academic stewardship.
What happened to the stones?
The sources highlight that several of Dr. Strong's most important specimens, which he submitted to the State Museum for study, were subsequently lost and never seen again. Whether that was negligence or deliberate disposal, it meant that crucial primary evidence was permanently removed from the scientific record. It's unavailable for future reexamination. That failure of custody does not instill confidence in the official narrative.
So given that the academic and institutional debunking was so flawed, we have to return to the geological reality check. Were the stones man-made, or were they the product of mass self-deception caused by the patterns of nature?
Let's look purely at the science of the diabase rock. As an igneous material, it's incredibly hard, but it weathers predictably. Dr. Robert Smith of the Pennsylvania Geological Survey estimated that East Coast diabase erodes at a rate of approximately 2 centimeters per 1,000 years.
Okay, so if we take Strong's claim of 2,500 years ago, 310 BC, what would an inscription have to look like today to still be visible?
To survive and still be recognizable, a carving made 2,500 years ago would need to have originally been cut at least 4 centimeters deep.
That's about 1.5 inches.
Roughly. And it would have been necessary to make these as steep, narrow cuts, which is generally not consistent with the shallow V-shaped grooves observed on most of Strong's collection.
So if they were truly ancient, they should look different.
They should appear today as broad, shallow lines where the weathering crust, that orange patina, had formed consistently inside the groove. Most of Strong's specimens did not fit that profile. It suggests that if the stones were ancient, the cuts were just too shallow to have survived 25 centuries of freezing, thawing, and erosion.
That's the geological hurdle.
It is, but the most compelling evidence against the inscriptions being deliberate carvings, Phoenician or otherwise, comes from an accidental modern discovery right in Strong's collection area.
This is the Ironstone Ridge Estates development.
Correct. Years after Strong's original finds, researchers visited an area near Carlisle, Pennsylvania, where construction had exposed thousands of fresh diabase rocks, and they observed a universal phenomenon.
What was that?
These rocks were covered in light gray streaks where the orange weathering crust had been recently disturbed or stripped away, and this disturbance wasn't done by tools.
That's a natural process.
Exactly. Tree roots actively seek out potassium, which is a key mineral in diabase rock. The roots cling tightly to the stone surface, and as they grow or are eventually torn away by human activity or natural decay, they rip off the thin, dark, orange weathering crust.
And that exposes the light gray, pristine diabase underneath.
Which often mimics the exact linear patterns found on Strong stones. Researchers were stunned to see that the natural action of tree roots, combined with soil disturbance, produced a mishmash of marks or Semitic letters.
The exact patterns that Strong had interpreted as intentional carvings.
It suggests that the vast majority of Strong's 400-plus collection was the result of a sophisticated, large-scale self-deception caused by the patterns of nature.
The geological reality check certainly dampens the Phoenician enthusiasm, but it doesn't entirely close the door, does it?
No, it doesn't.
We still have to account for that minority of stones that were deemed too angular, too intricate, or too unique to be simple root tracks. This led to alternative theories from researchers who were troubled by that flawed official debunking.
If they weren't Phoenician and they weren't natural, what were they? This is where we introduce one of the most controversial figures in American archaeology, Dr. H. Barraclough Fell. Barry Fell.
Fell was a Harvard marine biologist who famously turned into an amateur epigrapher in the 1970s. He claimed to decipher inscriptions all across North America and, in the process, earned the eternal ire of traditional academic archaeologists.
He certainly did. Fell visited the remaining Susquehanna Stones after the collection had been moved to a protected location in New Hampshire, and he disagreed almost entirely with Strong's conclusion.
He didn't see Phoenician.
He found only a few marginal Phoenician inscriptions. Instead, he proposed a connection to an entirely different and arguably older European group. He asserted that most of the markings were Iberian or Basque.
Pushing the narrative of pre-Columbian contact back even further.
By centuries. Fell's initial theory, published in his 1975 book, suggested that Strong hadn't found a mining camp. He had stumbled upon the necropolis or cemetery of an Iberian settlement dating back to approximately 800 BC.
And the stones, in his view, were funerary headstones.
bearing a script nearly identical to tablets found in Trás-os-Montes, Portugal. He was very detailed in his claims, asserting that the settlement was administered by an Iberian chieftain named Galba.
He even provided translations.
Oh, yes. Detailed, though entirely unverified by mainstream academia, translations of 2 stones, including one proclaiming, for example, Galba, sole ruler. If Fell was correct, the history of European contact in Pennsylvania predates the alleged Carthaginian refugees by 5 centuries.
And Fell also addressed the official debunking head-on, using the very piece of evidence Wythoff cited as proof of fraud, the fresh steel dust.
Fell was determined to defend the artifact, even if he disagreed with Strong's translation. He later modified his theory slightly in 1987, suggesting the stones might actually be 17th century markers used by the local Susquehanna Indians.
But he insisted the script was still Iberian or Basque.
Yes, perhaps preserving the memory of much earlier Basque encounters. And he used the historical record to counter the fraud claim.
How did he account for the steel traces in the grooves?
He argued that when William Penn established treaties with the local indigenous tribes, the payment often included highly valued metal goods, specifically steels. Fell theorized that the Indians, inheriting or learning the Basque script from ancient encounters, would periodically re-engrave their land boundary markers using these new steel tools to maintain the lines.
So the presence of metal traces didn't mean modern fraud in the 1940s.
It meant legitimate 17th century maintenance of Basque-influenced markers. It's an incredibly imaginative counter-argument, using archaeology, epigraphy, and historical treaty records to defend the authenticity of the object, even while rejecting the initial theory of its origin.
Whether or not you accept Fell's radical decipherments, and most traditional archaeologists still brand him an imposter, he forced a crucial consideration.
That if there was pre-Columbian contact, it wasn't just Phoenician. It opened the door to Iberian, Basque, or other European groups who possessed similar high-sea navigational skills.
Let's pivot back to that third possibility raised by Dr. Cyrus Gordon, the Indigenous connection. If the stones are neither Mediterranean nor simply natural root marks, could they represent a primitive American Indian script?
That possibility is actually the most challenging to the conventional narrative, perhaps even more so than the Phoenician theory.
Why is that?
Because it implies a level of literacy and written communication among pre-Columbian Eastern woodland tribes that is currently not accepted by mainstream archaeology.
And the discussion here has to include the distinction between Strong's Valley stones and the known, sophisticated petroglyphs carved into the islands of the Susquehanna River itself.
Correct. It's fascinating that Strong and his supporters never connected their simple valley stones to the much more complex, mysterious river carvings found on islands between Lancaster and York counties.
The ones nicknamed tic-tac-toe glyphs.
For their angular, grid-like appearance. Experts from the State Historical and Museum Commission, like Dr. Cadzow, believed these river carvings were immeasurably older than any possible Phoenician connection.
And they were highly sophisticated.
Extremely. Cadzow suggested these tic-tac-toe glyphs represented a far higher level of symbolic communication than the simple common Indian signs found elsewhere in the region. Their structure was intricate, almost abstract, suggesting a deep, forgotten meaning.
So if the river carvings represent a sophisticated ancient system,
then the possibility remains that Strong's simpler valley stones represent a highly primitive, local script that was in use perhaps just before or during the colonial era, a form of writing that has simply been erased from the historical record.
So the stones present this hierarchy of mystery: natural root marks, primitive indigenous script, 17th century native markers, Iberian headstones, or Carthaginian mining records. After all this debate, where are the remaining stones today?
Following the intensity of the controversy, the remaining collection, which amounts to several tons of diabase rock, was removed from the Strong family barn in Mechanicsburg. They were first moved to New Hampshire and then later relocated to a secured, protected site in Maine.
And they're now under the custody of the New England Antiquities Research Association.
NERA, yes. They are preserved, but still unproven and still highly controversial.
This brings us back to the core dilemma of the Susquehanna Stones. We are left with an effective stalemate in the evidence, a narrative defined by these conflicting interpretations.
The stones are either natural geological phenomena, the result of a brilliant but self-deceived scientist, a small-scale hoax compounded by natural patterns, or
the remnants of a forgotten history, whether that's Phoenician, Iberian, or Indigenous.
And the final true legacy of the Susquehanna Stones is less about who got there first, and far more about the problematic handling of ambiguous evidence in American prehistory. This case serves as a perfect illustration of the eternal clash between amateur enthusiasm and professional certitude.
The enthusiast, like Strong or Fell, brings the necessary passion and willingness to entertain truly radical possibilities that scholars steeped in conventional theory just won't touch.
But they often, as Strong did, like the meticulous, disciplined methodology required for proper authentication, risking the destruction of the very evidence they seek to preserve.
And conversely, the professional, driven by the desire to uphold an existing, painstakingly constructed historical narrative, is inclined to dismiss or even prematurely close the door on evidence that falls outside established bounds.
The fact that Wythoff's authoritative debunking was demonstrably laced with errors, cited non-existent studies, and that important specimens were lost or made unavailable for future study is a profound institutional failure.
The lesson for you, the listener, is maintain a healthy skepticism toward the finality of any historical narrative. The speed and decisiveness with which these mysteries were shut down by the official establishment does not instill confidence in the scientific process applied to other American enigmas.
Like the Back Creek Stone or the Newport Tower, things that resist easy explanation. We must actively encourage the re-examination of archaeological evidence that experts are inclined to ignore simply because they cannot explain it through existing paradigms.
The landscape of North America, even in quiet, suburban Pennsylvania, is still strewn with thousands of strange coincidences and enigmatic findings that defy easy categorization.
And that leads to a final, slightly provocative thought, building on that geological reality check we performed earlier.
If the patterns created by tree roots, seeking potassium, and the subsequent weathering of diabase rock can create markings that sophisticated 20th century scholars mistake for letters of the ancient Phoenician alphabet.
The foundational basis of our modern writing system.
Right. What does that suggest about the origins of the original alphabet itself?
Are we absolutely certain that the earliest forms of our writing systems, those basic angular shapes like Aleph, the ox head, and Beth, the house, came purely from intellectual thought and visual simplification? Or could the random recurring patterns of nature, the way shadows fall, the cracks in stone, the streaks left by roots, have entered the problem, subtly influencing and suggesting the primal forms that evolved into the complex scripts we use today?
Something to mull over as you contemplate the deep history hidden just beneath the surface of the earth.
Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into the enduring mystery of the Susquehanna Stones.
We'll see you next time.
Thanks for listening to this week's episode of the Uncharted Lancaster podcast. If you enjoyed the episode, be sure to subscribe and leave a rating or review wherever you listen. It really helps more people discover the show. For more fascinating local history, visit unchartedlancaster.com. And if you'd like to go deeper, check out one of Adam Zern's books at unchartedlancaster.com/books. Until next time, keep exploring.